Tonight's lecture is over environmental economics and consumption. It was summer of 1994, and Ray Anderson was feeling pretty good about things. His Atlanta-based company, Interface Carpet, was the world's leading seller of carpet tiles. Small, square pieces of carpet that are easier to install and replace than rolled carpet, and it was raking in more than $1 billion per year. One day, though, an associate from Anderson's research division approached him with a question. Some customers apparently wanted to know what Interface was doing for the environment. One potential customer had told Interface's West Coast sales manager that, environmentally speaking, Interface just didn't get it. Moving on, Anderson was dumbfounded. The carpet industry was not generally an eco-conscious industry. After all, synthetic carpet is made from petroleum in a toxic process that releases significant amounts of air and water pollution along with solid waste. Indeed, Interface used more than 1 billion pounds of oil-derived raw materials each year, and its plant in LaGrange, Georgia, released about 5.5 tons of carpet trimming waste to landfills each day. I could not think of what to say other than, "We obey the law, we comply," Anderson recalls. In other words, his company did things by the book in terms of the environment. Wasn't that enough? His research associate suggested that the company launch a task force to create a company-wide environmental vision. Anderson agreed, albeit reluctantly. Desperate for inspiration, Anderson began leafing through The Ecology of Commerce, a book by environmental activist, entrepreneur, and writer Paul Hawken, which one of his sales managers had lent him. The book told the story of a small island in Alaska on which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had introduced a population of reindeer during World War II. Although the reindeer thrived for a time on the available plants, eventually the population exploded beyond what the environment could support. The reindeer ultimately died out because, as Anderson explained, you can't go on consuming more than your environment is able to renew. Yet that, he suddenly realized, was precisely what Interface was doing, using more resources than it could possibly renew. And that brings us to key concept number 1. Life on Earth depends on ecosystem services provided by nature. Recognizing the value of these services may motivate us to protect them. So Anderson took his quest for sustainability to heart. Hawkins' book was a turning point. As I read the book, it became clear that, God Almighty, we're on the wrong side of history and we've got to do something, said Anderson. The choices businesses, and by extension consumers make, have tremendous impacts on the environment. The amount and type of energy and water they use, the way they handle the waste they produce, the raw materials they use, these decisions affect not only business operations themselves, but also Earth as a whole, especially considering the magnitude of the resources and waste that some large businesses use and produce. Anderson realized that he had to make changes to Interface. He needed to build a sustainable, environmentally sound business. Businesses that are environmentally mindful aren't limited to simply trying to minimize their impact on nature. They can look to nature as an economic system from which to learn and model their choices. After all, economics, which is the social science that deals with how we allocate scarce resources, is not just about money. So all the resources we depend on come from the environment. Ecological processes like water purification and pollination are essential and economically valuable ecosystem services that help produce the resources we depend on, such as timber, food, and water. We take many of these services and resources for granted, but some are priceless because there are no substitutes, such as the oxygen produced by green plants, which we need to survive. Economist Robert Costanza was the first to try to quantify the economic value of these resources, estimating their value in 1997 to be more than the global GDP, that is the gross domestic product. which is more than the dollar value of all goods and services to change hands in that year. By assigning a dollar value to these valuable, sometimes irreplaceable services, even though his figures are probably underestimates, we are acknowledging that they have value, and this in turn might make us more likely to protect the environment that supplies those services. Costanza's most recent analysis reveals that ecosystem services have steadily declined, and he predicts this decline will continue unless policy changes aimed at restraint and the wise use of resources are pursued. And that brings us to infographic number 1 on page 200. Robert Costanza and his colleagues evaluated Earth's ecosystem services and quantified their 2011 values to be around $125 trillion in 2007. When we degrade ecosystems, we reduce their ability to provide these services. He estimates that we have lost $20 trillion in ecosystem services since 1997 due to ecosystem degradation. And that brings us to key concept number 2. Human impact can be measured in terms of our ecological footprint, the amount of land needed to support our lifestyle. So when ecosystems are intact, they are naturally sustainable. They rely on renewable resources and provide services that help replenish and recycle these resources. But ecosystems will only be able to provide us with their valuable goods and services as long as we let them. As Anderson came to realize, when we degrade ecosystems by using more from them than can be replenished, we threaten our planet's ability to provide the services that we need, and this ultimately threatens our own future. Like many other businesses, Interface Carpet uses a lot of resources and generates a lot of waste, giving it a large ecological footprint. Businesses, individuals, and nations can calculate their ecological footprint as a way to quantify their impact on the environment, as well as identify actions that can decrease the impact. The United States, for instance, has a particularly high per capita or per person footprint in that it requires much more land area to support each person than it actually possesses. The country is forced to import resources from other countries and even export some waste. In fact, if the more than 8 billion people who populate the planet all lived like the average person in the United States, we would need the land mass of more than 5 Earths to sustain everyone. Like the United States, most developed nations have a high per capita footprint, but even developing nations with smaller per capita footprints contribute to overall impact, some a great deal due to their sheer size of their populations. According to the Global Footprint Network's 2018 assessment, humanity's combined footprint exceeds what is ultimately sustainable and has done so since 1970. And that brings us to infographic 2 on page 201. The ecological footprint is the land area needed to provide the resources for and assimilate the waste of a person or population, and may extend far beyond the actual land occupied by the person or population. It is usually expressed as a per capita value, that is, hectares or acres per person. The current world footprint would require about 1.5 Earths to maintain, but obviously we just have one Earth to work with. And that brings us to key concept number 3. The impact of a population generally increases as its size, affluence, and use of technology increases. However, the right technology can reduce resource use and pollution generation, thus helping to decrease impact. So researchers use the IPAT model to estimate the size of a population's ecological footprint or impact based on 3 factors: population, affluence, and technology. The premise is that as population size increases, so does impact. More affluent and technology-dependent populations use more resources and generate more waste than do less affluent and technology-dependent populations. Technology allows us to build more things, dig deeper, fly higher, all of which drain the environment. One caveat with regard to this model is that technology can have the opposite effect. Some technologies decrease rather than increase environmental impact. In 2006, for instance, Interface invented a new technology called tactiles, which are just 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares of adhesive tape that join carpet tiles together. In contrast with traditional quote-unquote spread on the floor adhesives, Interface's new tape is safer to use and makes it possible for customers to replace single carpet tiles easily. No need to replace the entire carpet when only a portion is worn or damaged. Interface also developed a way to recycle discarded carpets and fishing nets into new carpet. So their re-entry program 2.0 has diverted more than 100,000 tons of material from landfills. The company is close to attaining its Mission Zero goal to eliminate any negative impact on the environment, and the next step, according to CEO Jay Gould, who is carrying on Anderson's legacy, is to go from having no negative impact to having a positive impact, to be what Anderson called a restorative enterprise. To do that, they are tracking climate change with their Climate Take-Back plan. As part of that plan, they have developed a carpet backing made from recycled material and plant-based oils that they calculate stores more carbon than it emits. What Hawken realized and Anderson put into action was that if we continue to use resources faster than they are produced, we are going to run out. But it's not just about using up some valuable resources, it's also about not damaging the very ecological processes and species that provide them. And that brings us to infographic number 3 on page 202. The IPAP model suggests that the environmental impact of a society is based on the size of its population, its affluence, and its use of technology. As any of each of these factors increase, so does the population's overall impact. The right kind of technology, however, can lower overall impact. And that brings us to key concept number 4. If we harvest resources at or below the rate at which they are produced, that is, take only the natural interest, we will leave behind enough natural capital to replace what we took. So what kinds of essential resources does Earth provide us? Considered in financial terms, natural capital includes the natural resources we consume like oxygen, trees, and fish, as well as the natural systems, forests, wetlands, and oceans that produce these resources. Natural interest is what is produced from this capital over time. More trees and oxygen, for example, much like the interest you earn with a bank account. Natural interest represents the amount of readily produced resources that we could use and still have enough capital behind to, in time, replace what we took. Natural interest might be represented by an increase in a fish population, for instance, or new growth in a forest, basically the extra that is added in a given time frame. This is a little bit of a faulty analogy because most banks don't pay very good interest. And that brings us to infographic number 4 on page 203. Natural resources can be compared to the financial concepts of capital and interest. Natural capital is the wealth of resources on Earth and includes all the natural resources we use as well as the natural systems that produce some of those resources. Natural interest is the amount produced regularly that we could use and still leave enough capital behind to replace what we took. Moving on, when Anderson spoke to his employees in the summer of 1994 about his new plan for sustainability, he stressed that his goal was to begin putting back more than the company took from the planet. Up to that point, the company was using up far more natural capital in the form of resources like petroleum and water than was ultimately sustainable. Anderson realized that if we take more than is replaced, capital will shrink and therefore produce less the next year. Essentially, by taking 50% more resources than is sustainable, we are taking resources away from the future. When we liquidate our natural capital more quickly than it can be replaced, that is called income. The question becomes this: where will future income come from? This can be an especially big problem with commonly held resources like water. Once we remove it from wells or rivers, we have to wait for the next rainfall to replenish it. When many users are accessing the resource, it can quickly become depleted or degraded if they do not work together to manage it, a tragedy of the commons. Starting in 1994, Interface Carpet made major changes in the pursuit of its new goals. By 2017, the company had cut the amount of energy it derived from fossil fuels by 88% and reduced its total energy use by 45%. It did this in part by maximizing energy efficiency in its facilities, installing skylights to replace artificial electricity-dependent lighting, and installing more efficient heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. In one of its factories, Interface also installed a real-time energy tracker that displays energy use prominently for its employees to see, inspiring them to think of new ways to conserve energy. Although Interface declined to reveal how much money it invested in such improvements and technology, the company has ultimately recouped its cost in energy savings, according to a company spokesperson. And that brings us to key concept number 5. When the price of a product does not reflect the social and environmental external costs, those costs are paid by others rather than being passed on to the consumer. Internalizing these external costs better reflects the true cost of a product. So, current day or mainstream economics allows managers to evaluate possible resource use choices and make the most profitable decisions, often by seeking to maximize value, that is, achieving the greatest benefit at the lowest cost. However, one of the complaints against mainstream economics is that it doesn't consider all potential costs when trying to maximize value. For instance, a carpet tile might require a certain amount of material that has recognized monetary cost, but what about the environmental costs associated with drilling enough oil to make that material in the first place, or the costs associated with cleaning up the pollution it creates? To determine how much to charge for its goods or services in its quest to earn a profit, a business, such as a company that produces paper, must account for all its expenses. Wages, fees, insurance, building maintenance, and other expenses are all part of the internal costs of doing business. But nature also provides some ecosystem services that might be important to the businesses, such as nutrient cycles that support tree growth or water cycles that produce water for the trees. Because these services are supplied by nature free of charge and are not part of the cost of doing business, they are classified as external costs. However, the price of a good or service that is only based on internal costs is often incomplete because there can also be negative external costs, that is, problems that result from doing business that are not accounted for in an internal cost assessment, such as the health costs associated with waste produced by making a product or the environmental damage caused by pollution generated by the company. Historically, economists have regarded these two as external to the business. The business doesn't pay for them, and they aren't reflected in the price the consumer pays for the good or service. But if the business doesn't pay for the costs or pass those costs on to the consumer, who does pay? Other people, present and future, and other species do. They pay in the form of degraded health, ecosystems, and opportunities. So an assessment of a cost of a good or service or any of our choices should include more than just economic costs. It should also include the social and environmental costs, that is, the triple bottom line. By ignoring external costs, economies create a false idea of the true and complete costs of particular choices. A customer may pay $8 for every carpet tile, but the true costs for that piece of carpet would be much higher if it included costs such as greenhouse gas emissions and the cost of treating people for asthma who have fallen ill as a result of breathing the particulate matter that is released during the carpet's production. The inadequate valuation of a product could eventually lead to the exploitation or overuse of resources needed to produce it. An example of market failure: when external costs are internalized, on the other hand, people or species who don't benefit from the transaction do not pay for it. In this case, the product or service can be more appropriately priced or valued. This new price more accurately reflects the true costs of the product or service. Because we are accustomed to paying true costs, we would most likely be surprised at how much some goods and services would really cost if all externalities were internalized. Although it sounds discouraging, any time we purchase products that were made in a more environmentally sound or socially ethical manner, we come a little closer to bearing the responsibility for our choices. We also create a demand for these products in the marketplace. And if businesses are forced to internalize external costs, it then becomes profitable for them to take steps to lower those costs. For example, by installing pollution prevention technologies, a benefit that could lower the environmental and societal costs overall. And that brings us to infographic number 5 on page 206. Many environmental and health costs of our goods and services are externalized, that is, they are not included in the price that the consumer pays. But if the consumers don't pay all the costs to produce a product, such as paper, then who does? And that brings us to key concept number 6. Mainstream economics is criticized because it makes some assumptions about resource availability and value that are inconsistent with the way nature operates. Transitioning from linear economic models to circular systems that depend on renewable resources, and we see waste as useful input that can help address these shortcomings. So ecologically minded economists advocate incorporating environmental considerations into economic decisions. Environmental economics is a discipline that considers the long-term impact of our choices on human society and the environment. There are actually two camps, environmental economics and ecological economics, but their distinctions are not important for this discussion. For simplicity, we will combine them and use the term environmental economics. Environmental economists argue that without including environmental considerations, mainstream economic theory will fail because it is based on several erroneous assumptions. So one inaccurate assumption of mainstream economics is that natural and human resources are either infinite or substitutes can be found if needed. This is true for some, but not all resources. For instance, though we don't worry about running out of solar energy, fossil fuels are finite and will run out even with technological advances that allow us to access more fuel that is left. Crop productivity has limits. Soil can be amended with fertilizer additives, but it cannot be replaced for most crops. And there is no substitute for water. In addition, our actions can degrade the quality of air, water, and soil resources faster than nature can restore them. The fact that some resources are limited, finite, or replaced over a defined time frame leads to other erroneous assumptions. For example, mainstream economics also assumes that economic growth will go on forever. Since there are inherent limits to what Earth can provide, unlimited economic growth, at least that which depends on finite resources and the rate at which renewable resources are replaced, is not in fact possible. We have to work within the limits of available resources in ways that allow essential ecosystem services to continue. So another problem with mainstream economics is that it discounts the future. It tends to give more weight to short-term benefits and costs than it does to long-term ones. In other words, mainstream economies consider something that benefits or harms us today more important than something that might do so tomorrow. For instance, we value the tuna we can harvest today more highly than the tuna we might harvest 10 years from now. So the value of taking a large harvest of tuna today outweighs the benefits of taking less now to ensure there is still some later. If the money we could earn by using the resource now is higher than sustainable harvesting yields, modern economics tells us it is more profitable to use it now and invest the resulting money in another venture. But this investment approach doesn't take into account where those other ventures might come from or whether they are in any way diminished by the elimination of the first resource. We are back to the erroneous assumption that any resource can be replaced by another. How might the loss of tuna affect the ecosystem and other populations? Will there always be another fish population to harvest? So these assumptions lead to yet another misconception that models of production typically follow a linear sequence, a take, make, dispose approach. In this linear economic system, raw materials come in, humans transform those materials into a product, and then they discard the waste generated by the process. But because some resources are finite, if the waste created from the use of these resources is stored away permanently as quote-unquote waste, we will eventually run out of a needed input as supplies dwindle. In addition, generating waste in the form of pollution that damages natural capital such as air, water, and soil also reduces the amount of matter available to us. It is this unsustainable use of resources that will eventually cause linear models of production to fail. For instance, most traditionally produced carpets are made from fossil fuels, a practice that is not sustainable. Old, unwanted carpets are then discarded, and some are eventually burned, releasing toxic pollutants and greenhouse gases. So a sustainable approach would be more cyclical, where waste becomes the raw material once again and can be used to make new products. Interface Carpet's Reentry 2.0 program uses old carpet tiles to make new ones, and it uses old carpet backlings to make new carpet backlings. This is an example of a circular economic system where the product is folded back into the resource stream when consumers are finished with it, or it is disposed of in such a way that nature can decompose it and use it once again. To combat the erroneous assumption of mainstream economics, environmental economists support actions such as improving technology to increase production efficiency and reduce waste, valuing resources, including water, as realistically as possible, moving away from the dependence on non-renewable resources, and shifting away from a product-oriented economy. They look to natural ecosystems as models for how to efficiently use resources and live within the limits of nature. Many businesses today account for all the steps needed to produce a product and deal with any waste produced, a cradle-to-grave approach. But that approach is incomplete. Interface Carpets seeks to operate as a circular system by managing its product in a cradle-to-cradle fashion. It considers the entire life cycle of the product, from the beginning, that is the acquisition of raw materials, to the end of its useful life, its disposal, and it's responsible for the impact of its use at every stage of the process. This can lead to better material choices, less toxic, more sustainable, and better process choices, which is a reusable material, and less waste and less pollution. So Interfaced Carpets revolutionized its operations by considering itself part of a service economy. It focuses on selling a service rather than a product. The idea is simple. A customer pays for the service, such as the ability to photocopy or use a marimba when needed, and the vendor makes sure that that service is always available. Interface Carpets sells the service of carpet, its color, texture, and comfort, rather than the product itself. The customer pays a monthly fee to lease the carpet, and Interface Carpets maintains and replaces it as needed. This encourages Interface to produce carpet that is durable, recyclable, and easily replaceable. So another sustainable business practice involves take-back programs, particularly for products with a defined lifespan such as electronics. Customers return the product to the producer when they are finished with it or when they need an upgrade. This provides an incentive to the producer to make a durable, high-quality product that can be reused or recycled and ensures proper disposal of hazardous materials. Some of these programs are mandated by law. This is called take-back legislation. Others are voluntary and put in place by the manufacturer. So when he first vowed to make Interface Carpets sustainable, Anderson did not know whether his business would thrive or suffer as a result. He was very apprehensive about it, but he, along with other entrepreneurs who have followed suit, are finding that green business, that is doing business in a way that is good for people and the environment, is also profitable. It can provide a competitive advantage because the consumer is willing to support the company's efforts or because green actions end up saving money. After Interface Carpets filled out a 200-page questionnaire about how it was addressing various environmental issues, it beat out other contenders for a $20 million contract at the University of California. And that brings us to infographic 6A on page 207. Environmental economists criticize several assumptions of mainstream economics that they say will fall in the long run. Please spend a little bit of time reviewing this table. And this is infographic 6B on page 209. Environmental economics recognizes that the natural ecosystems provide our resources and assimilate our wastes. If companies could fold waste back into production or make sure it can be decomposed by nature, we could reduce our extraction costs and operate in a sustainable circular system. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Transparency in how a business operates will allow consumers to make better choices and level the playing field for businesses that are trying to operate more sustainably. Finding ways to consume less is also an important green choice. So what about consumers? We can all decrease our impact by making more sustainable choices and by consuming less. This doesn't necessarily mean doing without, but it does mean being mindful of our choices and opting for sustainable or low-impact choices whenever possible. However, this requires transparency from industries that produce and sell us goods and services. That is hard to come by with current business models, often because the businesses themselves don't know all the external costs associated with their products. For its new plan to be successful, Interface was counting on its customers to make more sustainable choices as well. And make them they did. Re-Entry 2.0 drew many new customers to Interface, including the Georgia State Legislature, which purchased 13,000 square yards of carpet. Despite Interface Carpet's strong desire to become sustainable, they have progressed slowly. Startup or upgrade costs can be substantial, and even though improvements may pay for themselves in the long run, many businesses simply do not have the funds to pay for them. In addition, they may find themselves at a competitive disadvantage with businesses that are not trying to internalize costs. Consumers also have a role to play. For example, recycled paper's higher cost may more closely reflect the true cost of paper, but if consumers are not willing to put their buying dollars behind their environmental ideals, businesses that make and sell paper from trees will still sell more and be more successful. In other words, it will take changes from both consumers and producers to put businesses and industry on the path to sustainability. But there are things that can be done to level the playing field. Governments can encourage sustainability by providing incentives for businesses to account for true costs rather than just internal costs. This could be accomplished by taxing companies based on how much pollution they generate, subsidizing environmentally friendly processes, or giving out pollution permits that companies could sell if they release less pollution than they are allowed. For instance, if there is a pollution tax, it will be passed on to the consumer, who then decides whether or not to buy the product. The manufacturer that minimizes waste production and relies on lower fossil fuel inputs than its competitors would be able to meet the regulations at the lowest cost, offer the lowest prices, and, as a result, have a major market advantage. While promising, these policies can be complex to implement because external costs are hard to quantify. How is a pollution tax fairly addressed? And because they may put a burden on smaller manufacturers that have less ability to absorb the cost of upgrades. Passing these costs on to the consumer also stresses low-income households. According to Anderson, the consumer needs to know how a good or service is made and what the overall environmental impact of that product is. One way to communicate this information is through eco-labeling. But consumers have to be wary of labels because as quote-unquote green products become more attractive to consumers, more companies engage in greenwashing, that is, claiming environmental benefits for a product when they are minor or non-existent. So fair trade items, however, are more likely to be sustainably produced. For a product to be certified as fair trade, workers must be paid a fair wage. They must work in reasonable conditions to produce the goods or services, and the production processes must have a low ecological impact. In other words, they have been produced in an environmentally and socially responsible way. Consuming less is also an important consideration. Share programs are another useful option for items that people need infrequently, such as a car for those who live in a large city. Rather than buying, owning, and then storing the product for a large part of the time, consumers share ownership and use the product only when they need it. Although Interface Carpets has come a long way since 1994, it is still working hard to achieve its sustainability goals. In June of 2011, the company began producing its first 100% non-virgin fiber carpet tiles made from reclaimed material fiber derived from salvaged commercial fish nets and post-industrial waste. By 2018, it was using 100% plant-based or recycled material as the raw material for all its products. Practices like intercepting industrial waste destined for landfills have a positive effect, while other efforts lessen the company's overall negative impact. Less toxic glues, less carpet waste, etc. All the while, Interface Carpets is still the world's leading manufacturer of commercial carpet tiles and is growing. And that brings us to infographic number 7 on page 212. The choices we make as consumers are extremely important in any quest to pursue environmental sustainability. Supporting green products supports those companies. We vote with our dollars. Responsible consumerism also means consuming less and looking for ways to meet a need other than buying new products. Green consumer practices include eco-labels, greenwashing, fair trade, share programs, green businesses, and lower consumption. And that brings us to our core message for this chapter. Humans have a high impact on the earth because of the way that we use resources. Humans often focus on short-term gains. Humans often focus on one issue instead of seeing the interconnected whole. And humans would be wise to use nature as a model. In summary, although Interface Carpets has come a long way since 1994, it is still working hard to achieve its sustainability goals. By July of 2018, all Interface products were made with 100% plant-based or recycled materials, and their business continues to grow. Economics must account for and work to protect the environmental resources we depend on. And consumers can decrease their impact by consuming less and opting for sustainable or low-impact choices whenever possible.